Okay, so a very welcome to everyone to this webinar series. Today we have a speaker or speaker for tonight. Obviously, I'm in Calgary, so I would call it tonight. Those in Pakistan is today. Is K. Behrensmeyer, who is a research curator in paleobiology in Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., USA. I'll be talking about fluvial architecture, landscape, and fossils preservations in the Miocene Sywalik sequence of northern Pakistan. Uh, there are a few speakers lined up for this series, and Bob will be discussing their names. Some of them have already have their dates fixed with the Bob. Others have just named them for their interest, and they will obviously uh, block the dates. But for those who want to see the previous lectures, I think I should have shared it, or Bob or Mukhtiar must have shared the link to the previous talk. So before that, we had Andre Meeks from Oregon State University, Peter Clift, Rajiv Patnaik, Mohammed Akbar Khan, and a lot of speakers, because this webinar series is probably now entering into the third month, Bob. The basic motivation, which actually came from Bob when he visited to Pakistan. And then obviously with the subsequent COVID and all these things, we just wanted to have an interactive session. And we thought that, well, online webinar series might be a very good thing. And it is really doing a wonderful job. I will now ask Bob to introduce the speaker and take the program further. Bob, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irfan. And just before I introduce Kay, I just want to alert people to the program coming in the next few weeks. Our following presentation, which will be on in the first week of May, is going to be Samina Siddiqui from the National Center for Excellence in Geology from Peshawar. And together with Irfan, she's going to be describing some of the impacts of oil and gas exploration in the Syawaliks in the Potwar area. Following that, the next week in May is Jason Head from Cambridge University in England. He's going to be talking about the reptilian fossils from the Syawaliks. And then the following week, about the 19th of May, we've got Parth Chauhan, who's a professor in India at the Indian Institute of Science, Education, and Research. And he's going to be talking about the search for hominids in the Syawaliks. And following that, we've got Lisa Taux, and then Peter Zeitler, and then others coming. So the program is certainly going to go for another couple of months, and we're delighted with the success and with the wonderful cooperation and collaboration of the Geological Survey of Pakistan in Quetta that Mukhtiar is organizing as our convener. This evening, it's my tremendous pleasure to introduce Kay Behrensmeyer. And Kay is somebody with whom I've worked for many years. And I first met Kay at Lake Turkana in Kenya. It must have been about 1972. And I was an undergraduate student then, and Kay was a graduate student. And I remember wonderful field opportunities with Kay, and she's been a sort of a guide and teacher to me for many, many years. And one of the things about Kay that's most impressive to me is her capacity to record detailed notes and capture information in difficult circumstances. And I was teasing Kay a couple of minutes ago about one of my early memories was it's very hot in the Rift Valley in Africa, and in the middle of the day, we would usually have a lunch and then maybe what we call a siesta, which is a time to sit in the shade and pretend to sleep in the hot part of the day. And I was thinking of maybe going to pretend to sleep in the hot part of the day, but I noticed some activity over near the kitchen, and there was a fire going, and there was a big pot boiling on the fire, and Kay was boiling a catfish to get the the bones because she was studying the bones and she wanted to be able to identify catfish bones. And so it was very hot. You know, it was like 40 degrees centigrade or 110 or 12 degrees Fahrenheit. And the fire was very hot and the catfish was very hot. And Kay was there calmly pulling the catfish apart and counting the bones. So Kay is a wonderful colleague and friend to many of us, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you, Kay Behrensmeyer from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And Kay, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It is really wonderful even just to be saying that and to be joining this great effort. The organizers should get so much credit for bringing us together on Zoom at a time when, well, it probably wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been the need to keep our intellectual lives going and our curiosity alive too. So I'm going to do my best to take you through some of the highlights of what I was able to do for many years with the wonderful teams of GSP and Yale and then Harvard researchers. They've been, all of you, those of you who are here and many who are not, I think I counted over 100 people on our list of colleagues that we've worked with in Pakistan over the years. We've tried to actually record that so we can remember. And anyway, a big thanks and a deep appreciation. The last time I was in the field was in 2000. My time went from 1977 through 2000, pretty much every year with a few exceptions. As Bob said, or maybe it was read, I started out as a geologist and my most fundamental expertise is probably in sedimentary geology. And then I branched out into taphonomy and vertebrate paleontology. And so I really appreciate being able to talk to a group of people who represent those interests. Okay, so I'm going to hope that this works. There.
Yeah, it's working.
It's working, good, thank you. Everybody knows where the Potwar Plateau is on this call, I'm sure, but I thought I should have this for part of the introduction. This is a glorious map because of the colors and the beautiful geological structures that you can see. So focusing down then on the Potwar Plateau, it's a Landsat image, I think has been a favorite for a long time. And is my cursor visible?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So these are our major field areas. The Chinji area, the core area, the Hasnot area, and Rotas over here. Of course, there's been work in between as well, but those are the areas I think Catherine also mentioned and John Barry a while ago. So a lot of what I'm going to say is based on just those portions of the Potwar. And this is a revised, simplified column with the dates as we now understand them for the boundaries, and also the fact that there are interfingering relationships, particularly between the Dokpatan and the Nagri, which I'll be talking more about as we go along. And as many of you who've been in the field know, the outcrops, the exposures are spectacular and lend themselves to so much careful study of different scales of the sandstones, the mudstones, the overbank deposits. All of this is fluvial, but variations on that theme. So, and there actually is our camp up here on the Nagri, so you can get an idea of this incredibly thick sandstone. This is near Sethi Nagri. And then the Dokpatan, here's a figure in a little circle here, this equally spectacular mudstone sequences and different kinds of sandstones in the Dokpatan than in the Nagri and the Chinji. Now, as you've heard from various people, we have a wonderful and long tested magnetostratigraphy. This is from an old figure. I'm trying to revise this for our book that we're working on. But we have the long sections, the vertical views with dates, some of which don't really fit anymore. Just a date up here and a date down here, and there are a few more dates near the top, the upper boundary tuff, for instance. But the sections can be linked in the different areas through the paleomag. And there's really, for those of you who are in the early stages of your career, there still is a lot to do to understand the paleogeography of the different lithofacies across the Potwar. And that could be possible much more than we've already done. But this section at Rotas has a particularly good isotope transition from the C3 to the C4. I'll be talking about that. And then a record going up to 2.4 million. So these stars mean this is where the time gets linked across. So altogether, it's quite an impressive, not exactly strictly continuous, but at some scales, very continuous record of the foreland basin and the fluvial facies that filled it. So my talk, I'm going to have three parts. First, about the fluvial systems and the architecture, and I wish I had more time to say more about all the wonderful work that's been done there, but I'll focus on just a few themes. And then the vertebrate preservation, there's a lot to that, and I'm going to focus mainly on the context in the fluvial sediments, where we find the fossils, where we've learned to go looking for them by zeroing in on particular facies. And then particularly the paleo landscape reconstruction, where you integrate sediments, the paleosols, and then the stable isotopes that are based on the pedogenic carbonate nodules. Starting with the fluvial systems, this Google Earth image I prepared for the book that we're finishing soon, just to give myself and others a view of, this enormous basin. And we're really just sitting here in the western end of it. And there's a lot that must have been going on all the way through this, but a lot of it is subducted, or it's too crunched by the tectonics to be very informative. And because of the underlying décollement of the salt, the Eocambrian underlying salt, we have this less structurally deformed plateau that we are lucky to be able to study. And this is, I'm not even sure whether this is the Indus or not, but it's a view of the river systems and how complicated they are with channels. Here's an abandoned one. There's a major one here. They're braided systems. They have meandering segments, but these are aggradational braided systems for the most part. Now, Brian Willis and other students of John Bridge came over and did a number of different theses. Imran Khan was one of the graduate students, worked in the Miocene area. Brian Willis worked in the Chinji, and this is just one of the figures from his work. This is one of the sandstones. You can see them here in the picture. So these are the gray sandstones. These are current directions. Brian measured all of the along here on one way or another. He had to climb up some pretty steep cliffs because these are steep sandstones often. Intrepid geologists with very long legs. And so he was able to show these multi-storied sandstones, but they're bounded by paleosols, and that's what these lines are, the vertical lines. So that it's an unusual kind of sequence. You had a big sandstone coming along, and then you had a period when that surface was stable and the paleosols formed on top of it. And then there was aggradation of the floodplains and more paleosols, some isolated channels that are more simple. So it's that kind of complex architecture that is very representative of the Chinji. And if you were interested in hydrocarbons and whether they could transfer themselves through porous sandstones, you'd be very interested in this kind of, this of course is a cross section, but these are very big sheet sands as well. In the Dokpatan Formation, this is a view that shows a gray sand, very much like the one one's in the Chinji, but then there's a buff colored sand. And early on, this is in the area of Gandakas and the core area to the north in the syncline. And we noticed that there were different kinds of sandstones. So Catherine and I actually walked a lot of this 40-kilometer, not all at once, line of this one sandstone called the U sandstone. And these are the sections along it, as well as very long ones. But these are short sections because we were very interested in the lateral patterns as well as the vertical patterns. And that relates to what the landscapes were looking like. And those are where the fossil animals once lived. So it all kind of ties together. You have the vertical, the lateral, and then the fossils. And what we found, and this was work with Lisa Tokes, and she'll probably be talking about that later in the series, is that we had the blue-gray system in the southwest that interfingered with what we call the buff system. And this goes on for millions of years, actually, with shifting back and forth. And one of the ways that you can be sure that this is true is to have an isochron. So this is a paleomagnetic isochron through here, definitely showing what's happening. There's another one up here that even on the ground, it's pretty obvious that they're interfingering. But of course, as many of you know, for a long time it was assumed that the Nagri gave way to the Dokpatan, and that was isochronous formations. Well, not at all. And the paleomag lateral work plus the tracing of these sandstones also showed that. The buff system has a distinct southeast current direction in the channel sands, and the blue-gray has a more distinct eastward direction in the Potwar. And I know Bob Reynolds also was very interested and did a lot of work on that. Probably other people have too. We were constantly looking at and recording the current directions as we were walking over these sandstones. And also, I did some petrographic work early on to show that the blue-gray sands were much less mature and fit with a mountain-sourced interpretation. That is, they were coming down and were physically weathered and brought in, whereas the buff system sands showed much more evidence of being weathered, concentration of quartz, spending time in soils and in sediments where more clays were formed, and you could see that clearly in the thin sections. And just for comparison, here's the Indus River and the Soane River sand, not as different as these two systems. But then there's also a lot of reworking going on into those, especially the Soane River now from the erosion of these others. So it was pretty well established that there were these two different systems, and they were interfingering for a considerable period of time. And this is a reconstruction of the 100-kilometer scale, the mountains, rising Himalaya, and then these different orders of streams and rivers feeding into them. And this is consistent with what we know of the current directions. And this little square is the size of the Potwar, approximately. So again, putting this in the perspective of this overall basin. But you had river systems joining into each other. These are, we think, seasonal, perhaps. There aren't any lake deposits per se, but at least not recognizable. But there are marls, there are wetland type deposits. And this big trunk river that likely was feeding along here and meeting up with eventually with the Ganges at this time, the proto-Ganges, we don't actually have recorded in the Potwar. They're very big channels, but none of them are that scale. So this would be one of these mountain-sourced tributaries to the trunk river, and then foothill streams would be coming in from these kinds of source areas. And just for fun, I looked along the modern front of the Himalaya. And this is the Sankosi River, which is mountain sourced, and then here are the more foothill sourced streams. And this line is comparable to the reconstruction of, in this block diagram, of several stages of the blue-gray and buff system. So in this one, the buff system has transgressed over the blue-gray, and then there's even evidence for some cutting down periods, and then it's coming back up and pushing in a sense, the buff system back toward the northeast. What is driving these cycles, we haven't yet figured out, and that's another wonderful opportunity for research, because it's possible that it's on a Milankovitch kind of tempo, or some other large-scale cycling of the input of more mountain-sourced versus foothill-sourced sediment. Now this then summarizing, the blue-gray fluvial systems disappear about, well, in Rotas, about 7 to 8 million years. The buff systems come in for the first time around 9.5. They overlap for a while, that's the interfingering. And then you just have the buff systems. And that represents also, of course, the continuing uplift of the foothill areas and coarser material coming into, and you know, if you've been out there, that the last coatings of deposits, there are lots of cobbles and boulders across the Potwar that obscure sometimes outcrops you'd like to be able to see. Okay, so I hope there'll be questions about that segment. I won't stop now, but I'm going to now tell you something about tafonomy for those people who may not be familiar with it, and then focus on the fluvial context for fossil preservation. So tafonomy is the study of the transition of organic remains from the biosphere to the lithosphere, a rather grand definition. And on this diagram, I've tried to lead you through this. It's often talked about in stages, biological processes starting with death, and what happens to carcasses in the early postmortem environment, the later burial. A lot of these are biological processes, including decomposition, of the soft tissues and some of the hard tissues as well. But geological forces take over gradually. Of course, burial, it's important in order to preserve anything to have rapid burial. And then the long-term survival and whether we get to see these as fossils uplifted to places where we can find them is all under the control of tectonics. And these are just names for some of these parts of the taphonomic sequence. Now, over half of the known fossil bone beds, and that's looking through the Phanerozoic, a kind of survey that I did a while ago, there are in river deposits. So fluvial deposits are incredibly important. These are actual bone beds with lots and lots of bones, which we don't have really in the Siwaliks, but it's a very, very important context to understand. Now, this Siwalik flora and fauna, we know, inhabited a vast alluvial plain. This is, I don't actually know the source of this, but it shows the river, this nice reconstruction with some of the animals. But this plain was thousands of kilometers as maybe one fairly continuous habitat during the Miocene, as the whole system was evolving. Here's a typical fossil locality in the Chinji Formation with some of my valued colleagues looking for fossils. That looks very much like Jay Quaid. And John Barry, and this is a typical kind of thing when we would come across a new area with fossils. The localities are often very well defined on the ground. And then people would collect and we'd carefully document what was going on with the microstratigraphy, micro being the few meters. And Catherine and Mahmoud did a lot of that in the different parts. Well, Mahmoud did it in the Chinji and Catherine did it mainly in the Dopatan, but we did a lot of careful documentation of the geological context. But you'll also see here, this is on top of a big blue-gray sandstone. And that turned out to be a fairly common pattern, so that we actually would follow along. It was pretty easy to walk, and there often were fossils in this context. So here's an example of one called Y690, about 13.1 million years. Here's the blue-gray sandstone. Here's the bedding above it. Very distinctive. And here's where the fossils occurred and this is a channel fill. So there's several phases of filling with some reworked sand. And then finally, the dying channel had finer grained deposits in it, and that's what these are. So we began to realize there were distinct types, and these are in this diagram are represented 4 different major types: sheet deposits, which are basically crevasse splays out of the major channel. The major channels, which could be a kilometer or so across, or even more. But again, not the major trunk rivers, but they were sometimes had ponded areas and lateral accretion deposits. Sometimes they had layers of conglomerate down in them. And in the tops of one of these, this is from our locality on the big thick Nagri sandstone, Y311, often very complete and oriented bones, where we did quite a few excavations. The floodplain sediments had many fewer fossils, but occasionally we came across something like this famous Shivapithecus skull and jaw. It was coming out of one of these unusual floodplain burial environments. And then floodplain channels turned out to be extremely productive. And they've had both sort of winnowed and concentrated transported remains, but also a lot of abandoned channels where the bones accumulated. You might wonder why they would accumulate there. Well, there were dry seasons in this alluvial plain, and that's where the remaining water would have accumulated and collected and been available for a lot of the animals to concentrate around during the dry season. And you can imagine the predation, the herbivores trying to avoid becoming taphonomic events for the predators that would be lurking around. So this is really the overview of almost all of our fossil deposits and where they occur. There are a few den assemblages, the burrows, even aardvark burrows, but those aren't on here because they're just so rare. So now a little digression, because a lot of places where I've worked, and maybe others of you have worked, bones tend to be in lag deposits. This is really amazing. Every little dot you see here is a bone fragment on the bottom of a channel, just like this. And this is in Ethiopia in the Pleistocene. But this is typical of a lot of other places too, that the banks on eroding, meandering streams are harvested. The bones are harvested out of those by the bank erosion, and they fall in, and then they break also just from transport. Some of them may already be fossilized. And so this ends up being a fairly fragmentary, still rich sometimes, and still very interesting paleontological assemblage. And it fits this kind of fluvial architecture where you have lateral accretion building up, and it's fairly slow, slowly aggrading fluvial systems. Well, that's not really what we have in the Siwaliks, although sometimes this applies to particular areas. What we have are the bone preservations in abandoned channels, and that is consistent with the rapidly aggrading fluvial system we know was typical of the foreland basin. So you get channel switching, you get avulsion because you're building up the alluvial lobes rapidly, and then the channel has to go elsewhere. And that's still happening, of course, today with channels switching around on the Gangetic plain. So in cross section, this is what that would look like. And so we're fortunate in a way that it's more of this kind of system than the one I showed in the previous slide that's given us our fantastic Siwalik fossil record. And this is a tally of 295 localities that we were able to classify according to this scheme. And this is by formation. So the Camliel, you can see that floodplain channels are dominant throughout. The major channels are common in the Nagri, but there aren't that many localities in the Nagri. And then you get more floodplain as you get into the Dukbatan. And this is just a schematic diagram to make the point of 78% of our localities are in different sized channels. So there are many different sizes. This is the top of a major channel. And then there's some in the floodplain sediments. But very rarely do we find any reworked concentrations of fossils in the bigger sandstones. Now, a study I did looking at panels with fossil localities through time, this was actually published in 1987. I didn't manage to get that on here, but first of all, I'd like you to look at this is Chinji and Upper Chinji, and then this is in the Nagri, and then up in the Dukbatan. and then finally higher in the Dokpatan. And during that time, the sediment accumulation rate is steadily increasing until you get about the same between these two. Now, this is also the time of the blue-gray fluvial system and the buff system, and they overlap here. But the abundant channel fills go right through both of these systems. And I'm realizing that over again, that there's something about the way the fluvial system was working that was avulsion dominated. So there were lots of channel switchings going on until you get up to this point. And this is also when our overall fossil record kind of declines, because there really were not that many areas conducive to that kind of preservation anymore at that stage of the development of the basin and the tectonics. So the point, sort of take home from this, is that it's all tied together. The largest scale of what's going on with the foreland basin ultimately is helping to control the kinds of places where we get the fossil record. Okay, now moving on to the stable isotopes and the paleo landscape vegetation and climate reconstructions. And I wish I had more time actually for stories about people, but here's one of our field crews when all of us were very young and energetic. Here's Mahmoud Anwar. Here's Brian Willis, John Kingston, various other folks, but I've circled Jay Quaid and Turi Sirling because they were leading the stable isotope work. And in fact, much of it was that now is applied widely over the whole globe to terrestrial sediments was pioneered in the Siwaliks. And then Michelle Morgan came along and also did quite a lot of work, but with isotopes and dental enamel of the animals. So I'm going to say something about that toward the end. And of course, here's, whoops, okay. I'll just go on. Here's John Berry over here too. Catherine. So for those of you who are not intimately familiar with isotopes, stable isotopes, using carbon to infer paleovegetation as a matter of measuring the weight of the different carbon isotopes. And carbon 13 is heavier, and it is concentrated by a particular kind of physiology of plants called C4, and that is typically in grass, whereas dicot plants have, and some kinds of grasses have a different kind of metabolism that concentrates lighter carbon. So that's what C3 means. And this is just to give you an overview. So these are the readings that you get from doing the analysis of the soil carbonate, and you can also do that on enamel of animals, but there's a slightly different scale for that. So in the Siwaliks, we have a lot of wonderfully preserved paleosols with these kinds of root casts, which are carbonate, and large nodules, different scales of them, and also iron hydroxide nodules. This is just a typical view of one of these paleosols. Now, many of you will be aware that the major transition is captured in the Potwar Plateau between the C3 world that went up to about 8 million years, and then this is all from soil carbonate, and it was researched by Jay Quaid and Turi Sirling. And then this transition over several million years into a C4 world. That was now recognized at different times over most of the continents. And this is just the comparable oxygen curve, which is not as clear cut, and that has to do with a lot of other variables. But it still shows a trend toward greater evaporation with more exposure in grasslands later on. But you can also see these lines of samples. These are where I did a study of the lateral variation at different levels in the Rotas sequence, and that's what I'm going to show you now. So Rotas anticline is well exposed, not quite as well exposed as some of the areas to the north and west, but fine for looking laterally. You can see the nice strike ridges here. This is J. Quay standing on the first carbonate paleosol that had a very strong C4 signal. And this is where the transition occurs with the paleomag. And these are the levels for the examination of the lateral variation. And the idea was that maybe if we could look far enough laterally, we could actually detect a mosaic of different vegetation, because if there were C3 plants growing, trees and shrubs growing in one area, and then you walk a kilometer or so and you've got grasslands, and that's what you might expect during this transition time. So here are the panels, kind of a complex diagram, but also the blue, gray, and buff systems are indicated in the colors here. So this involved a lot of digging, a lot of teamwork, a lot of coordination to get the stable isotope samples out of these paleosols and documented in each one of these sections very carefully. Here's some big root casts, implying that there were some pretty big probable trees growing on that soil at one point. So I'm just going to focus on this red outline, R15, because it had two paleosols that we looked at. But first I'm going to say something about the model for this lateral variation, which I was just kind of mentioning, that you have higher evaporation over more open areas, lower evaporation over more shaded areas, so this affects the oxygen, but it also predicts that maybe in the abandoned channels or the places where there's more water, you will have more of the C3 plants. And where there's less water underground, you would have more of the C4 plants, at least seasonally. All this whole plain was probably flooded during the rains, but we're looking at precipitation of carbonates that would have occurred during the dry season. And then, you know, each one of these soils represents thousands of years of slow accumulation or just stability, where these plants were growing and the carbonates were forming. So there actually are three models here where this implies that time 1, time 2, time 3, that the positions of the trees and the grass don't change. So you'll actually be able to detect in the nodules this lateral change. In this case, it's a transition from more grass to more trees, and that's getting mixed into the same soil. So ultimately, you might not be able to say anything, see anything that's different, although you might detect a gradient through time. And in this one, it's just the same kind of habitat, all averaged over the 3 time periods. So we're going to try to test which one of these models works. So this is 2 successive paleosols at Rotas, about 6.8 to 6.7 million. And there's an isochron as well here, which nicely defines the bottom of one of these abandoned channel fills. And the soil just goes right across it. So in the best possible world, we might expect that there would be more C3 out in this direction where the trees could tap into the water that's in this abandoned channel, and more grass over here. What's going on with this one? It's very red, and that's not quite true to color here, but I wanted it to be distinct, and a very laterally continuous paleosol. So here are the same panels, but representing the stable carbon isotopes. So that upper soil, in fact, does have a trend going from more grass, more C4, into the top of the abandoned channel, and it's more C3. Whereas this paleosol 2 is just C4 all the way along. Now, these are successional, so it looks like we were having patches of grassland, even older than this evidence for a more mosaic kind of habitat. So during this period of transition, there was clearly a lot of going on, but we are able to detect it with the stable isotopes. And so our model, this model of stability over probably thousands of years in order to retain this signal through time, fits here. And paleosol 2 is more like a continuous environment, probably with many fewer trees than I'm showing here. And now stacking them up through time, a very dense figure, but the oldest one showed mainly a C3 signal at 8 million, so more like this. And then we get into the time when, like, paleosol 2 shows that there are patches of open grassland. This shows that there are places where there's both trees and grass and short distances from each other. And in this one at 5.8, there's again a mosaic of different vegetations. But then when you get up to 5 million and 2.4 million, all that we're seeing is a grassland. Now, there must have been places where there still were trees. And in fact, there are paleosols that don't have carbonate that may represent those. But it was definitely a major transition that we can pick out in these panels, as well as the overall vertical diagram that I showed earlier. And also, interestingly, in this lowest time, this is looking at different contexts for these soils. They're pretty much all clustered. So the floodplain red soils, the floodplain yellow soils, and the crevasse splay soils were all down in the C3 realm. But then they start to pull apart. And as you'd expect, the channel fill stays more moist in C3, whereas the others are tending toward more grass. Here's a crevasse splay red, but then over here, they're all moving in that direction toward having more grass. And finally, you just have that one up at the top. Now, I'm going to wrap up here with just a quick note about Michelle's work on the dental enamel, because that's also pretty cool. We didn't know what we'd find. Here we are back at the panel diagram of the blue-gray and the buff system. And the fossil localities are indicated in red here. And these are also collecting intervals. So a lot of fossils from this particular, it's about 50-meter thick. And this is about 35 kilometers laterally for the fossils. So I've listed the major kinds of animals over here, and when they were plotted in terms of their delta 13 carbon, there was a trend going from the blue-gray system over to the buff system from the southwest to the northeast. Here's Shivapithecus, staying pretty much down in the C3 realm, but a little bit of a tendency to be more open over here, and then especially is apparent with the equids, the hipparians, the grazing animals, we think. At least some of them were. And then we have these two kinds of pigs and giraffe. They're all showing, and this is statistically significant, some kind of gradient in the vegetation that was consistent with this transect from the more foothill source to the more mountain source ecosystem. This is just to summarize then the major points. Our window that we have in the Potwar, which is so wonderful, allows us to see that there are these two systems interfingering and shifting through time with the tectonic evolution of the basin. And the vertebrate preservation correlates with the abandoned channels, and therefore also was controlled by the changing dynamics of the fluvial systems. But I think there's more to understand there. And then we can actually reconstruct using the integration of the lithofacies, the paleosols, the stable isotopes, details of the landscapes that were inhabited by the Miocene flora and fauna. And I just wanted to end on the positive note of there is great potential. You may think that an awful lot has been done, and it has, but there are great opportunities to build on this work into the future, and I hope we can all do as our best to help to foster that. And just my continuing thanks to all the wonderful people I've been associated with through the many decades. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Kay. It was a nice presentation. Yeah, I would not like the floor to be open for questions. If someone wants to have a question, please raise your hands and I'll entertain it.
So, Kay, I'll ask a question just to get started. I'm curious about the definition of the mountain river, and you suggest that it's a big river, but maybe not the main trunk stream. Could you? I mean, I guess at some points we've speculated whether there might be Indus River sands in the core area, and what are your feelings about the blue-gray sandstone? What river does it represent?
Well, that I've returned to thinking about that recently. The problem is with Brian Willis's work on the architecture, and also Mike Zalea and Imran, they just didn't find any rivers that were of the scale of the modern Indus. Now that doesn't mean that it wasn't a smaller system in those times. So you know, we're seeing, especially in the Nagri, these enormous multi-storied sandstones. So that must have been a pretty huge river that was fairly permanently positioned in one area so that it could build up so much thickness. But I think the jury is still out on whether that's the Indus or not. And that's, I'd like to hear what other people might think about that, and catch up with the rest of you on is it the Indus? I mean, the current directions are very consistent. So the Potwar was not there, you know, at the time it uplifted around 3.5 or 3 million. So, and then things changed with the drainages. But during this time, there's also a river that's feeding into the Indian Ocean. So where did that come from? And how did those two source areas, or one, divide up to be the Indus, you know, the proto-Indus versus the headwaters of what later became the Ganges?
Okay, so we have Dr. Milan Kumar Sharma. Please unmute your. Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. Actually, it's a wonderful lecture, madam. I have a small query, madam. In one of your slides, you were mentioning that in the Dog-Patan formations, we are having the increase of the floodplain type of environment you were showing. So in the case of Indian deposits in the Dog-Patans, we are getting the multi-story sandstones, which are highly pebbly, and we are getting very coarse grained sandstone, and we consider it's in the Brother River streams environments. And I have not been working in the Siwaliks of Pakistan, but I was fortunate enough to work in the Indian sections when I was in Geological Survey of India. So what are the evidence that how can it be increasing the floodplain environment? If the floodplain environment is increasing, then ultimately, madam, I think that the mudstone and the siltstone, this percentage would be very high. Do you get such type of sequences in the Dog-Patan that the high mudstone and this siltstone parts, this component is increasing?
I'm just putting this slide back on. I hope you can see it. The Dog-Patan, let's see here. Okay. This is a fairly typical sequence of Dog-Patan with mainly mudstones, and this would be around 7 million years old in the Potwar Plateau. As you go up, though, above 7 million to 6 million, it becomes much coarser, and then it would look quite different. So I think it all depends on what was happening with the subsidence in different places, and if and also the source area was providing finer or coarser material, and that could have varied all the way along the mountain front. In what you call the Dog-Patan in India may have been formed by drainages that were coming out of the uplifting foothills, and with lots and lots of gravel and other coarse sediments, if I've understood you correctly.
Actually, madam, in many of the sequences you have mentioned about the buff and interfingerings, and obviously, madam, such type of interfingering we also used to get in the Indian sections, especially in the Nagri and the Dog-Patan sequences, and then also in the upper Siwalik we are getting in the Pinjore and the Statute formations also, madam. Actually, the concept of this particular lithostratigraphy, if we are doing about the lithostratigraphy, and if we are getting the mudstone sequences and the siltstone sequences is dominant, then why don't we keep in the this one in the Nagri formations instead of the Dog-Patans? And in the standard classifications, I think that majority of the Dog-Patan formations we consider as a multi-storied sandstone, and then these very coarse grained sandstones plus pebbly sandstones, and with the percentage of the siltstones and the mudstones, it's very less as compared to the other formations like the Nagri and then other Chinji. And is it your classification based on a time stratigraphy, chronostratigraphy frameworks? Yes, obviously, if we are doing on the chronostratigraphy, it can be, but in the lithostratigraphy, if we are saying, madam, I feel that if we are having the this other environments, then why don't we keep in the different formations? That is the
question.
I
see. Okay, I get it.
Yeah, it's about the percentage of fine versus coarse sediments, and the placement in different packages. Yeah.
Let me see if I can go to this one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are still thinking of these in terms of the percentage of course, sandstone versus mudstone in a stratigraphic sense. So that's what, if you see the bars on here, this means that it's dominantly sand. And then when you get into the Dokbatan, it's dominantly mudstone. And sometimes it's very hard to draw a line between the formations in any given section because that can be quite variable. So, but I still think that the formation names are useful and they're mappable units. That's what a formation should be. And when you get to the boundaries between them, laterally or vertically, then you can have lots of fun discussions in the field about what to do. But I don't think that should get in the way of understanding that these were different systems interacting with one another through time, and that's a fascinating story in itself.
Doug
Thank you, ma'am.
Burbank
Thank you, ma'am.
has a question. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Doug.
I just one quick question. Are the dates on this particular slide, are those fission track ages, or are they zircon ages, uranium lead ages on these ashes? It seems like that would be an easy thing to do to increase the precision of these ages.
Yeah, I mean, these are so old now.
Yeah.
I think some were even biotite, and they don't quite fit. Detrital zircons would be wonderful. Fission tracks were tried, I think, at one point. We don't pay a lot of attention to these dates now because we have the paleomag to go on, and this needs revision. I didn't have time to revise
Sure.
the polarity timescale, but
Okay, so the other question I had was just whether there's a signal of the strengthening of the Indian monsoon system that you see through this record, and or whether that is indistinct within the fluvial context that you're, the depositional context and the isotopic data that you have.
That's a really good question, because the isotopes have always been interpreted as indicating that is the C3 to C4 transition as the strengthening the monsoon, strengthening of seasonality, and seasonality is key to whether you have the grass being dominant or the trees being dominant on the landscape. And we do get also evidence from the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that is a biomarker for the increase of fire, which goes along with the seasonality. And it's in a couple of, I didn't have time to go into that, but that's been work done at Penn State, and it's really intriguing that you can get signals out of the paleosols that are still intact for these biomolecules that record the transition from less burning on the landscape to more burning on the landscape, which that won't happen unless you have strong seasonality. But how it actually is expressed in the lithofacies, I don't see that anything really marked going on during this time. And it seems that it's more under the control of the input, the underfilling, overfilling, or balanced filling of the foreland basin by these different fluvial systems. However, if we could get a signal out of the cyclic sandstones, we might be able to see some kind of relationship with what's going on in the mountains and the input of the more mountain source materials. That doesn't necessarily have to correlate with the monsoon, though. That could just be the uplift of the Tibetan Plateau.
Yeah. Neat. All right.
But yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating problem. I think we need to take a closer look at it and see what you'd predict should be happening with the onset of the increase of the monsoons. If it's not just happening in the paleosols, I mean, and we're seeing some signals in them going upward.
Right. Neat. Thank you.
Rajiv?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, we can.
Thank you, Dr. Behrensmeyer. It was a wonderful talk. I just really enjoyed it. My question is, I have actually two questions. One is about why don't we get many fish fossils like the what you call catfish you were talking about? I mean, what is the taphonomy reason? And the other one is, when do we start getting ponding in the whole sequence? When do you start finding a lot of ponds or maybe small lakes?
I didn't quite hear the last, but the fish are, well, Catherine is our current expert on fish because she's just finished a chapter for the book looking over all of that. And we do have a fair number of fish. They're often neglected, but we did some standardized sampling. So they are there. They're mostly catfish. There are occasional fish beds where they apparently had a pond that dried out and or a small lake. But some of the deposits that turned into paleosols eventually, and are overprinted with all the paleosol features may have started out as ponds, and we just don't have a clear record of good lake-sized ponds the way you'd expect them to be, at least seasonally. So that's a bit of a mystery, and sometimes these paleosols, especially ones that have glade soil, which is originally probably reducing, do have fish remains kind of scattered through them. So we may just be, we need somebody to go out and specifically look at this, the fish record, I think, because too many people are interested in the mammals and some in the reptiles and not enough in the fish. It's good. And so then, could you repeat your second question?
Yeah, I just, when do you start getting a lot of ponds in the system?
The ponds, well, we just don't. I mean, we don't see them. And the marls, sometimes you get carbonate marls that must have been in shallow ponds, and you can trace them for maybe tens of meters, rarely hundreds of meters. And so, but they're very bioturbated, they're very rooted, and they indicate that if it was a pond for a while, then that was overprinted with, as it was drying out, the system then got vegetated and trampled, and all the nice lamination, if it was ever there, is gone. Sometimes in these abandoned channels, you do find fairly well bedded sediment. You have to dig to find it. And you'd expect those to be ponds that would be somewhat permanent. But we don't have anything you'd call an oxbow clay, like in meandering systems, you get oxbows, and certainly no concentrations of organics. So the water table, I think overall must have gone up and down a lot seasonally. And when it went down, all the possible vegetable material that we wish we had more of in the fossil record was just oxidized and consumed.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have Sudesh Wadhawan.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. K. Very informative talk and very interesting slides we have shown the field. My elementary question is, do we get evidences of catastrophic paleo floods?
Oh,
Because the terrain was, tectonically very, very active. And you have also mentioned that most of the fossils were, concentrated in abandoned channels. Now, could that be because of these paleo floods and mass extinction of the animals, and they're getting preservation in some of those channels?
that's two very good questions. The first is we do see evidence for catastrophic flooding in the erosion into the floodplain sediments of some of these big sandstones. They're just are huge blocks that are disrupted and undercut places. And I don't know if you know the name Peter Friend, who's a retired professor at Cambridge, but he worked on that sort of thing with us for a while. And he pointed out some of these amazing features at the bottom of these big channels. But in terms of the idea that any of those floods would have brought in a lot of animal bones or live animals and killed them as a mass death assemblage, we do not have those kinds of deposits. The bones that we find in the abandoned channels are usually fragmented, but because of trampling or predation, scavenging, you can see the kinds of breaks they have. And sometimes we find very delicate remains as well as very robust remains together. So there's no evidence of a lot of sorting by current action. And besides which, if you have a big flood, and they're still happening today, I know, from coming out of the mountains, and it sweeps everything in front of it, including the unfortunate animals and people. The usual thing is that those bodies will get dispersed, and unless there's some block or some blockage or trees or something that cause them to hang up in one place, it's very rare to get that kind of a flood event leading to a mass bone assemblage.
So what could be the reason for their getting segregated in abandoned channels, these fossils, these bones?
I think it's just the combination of an attractor for the live animals. Say during the dry season, they're looking for water, they're looking for vegetation to eat. There's more of that around these channels, so they concentrate there over time, not just all at one time, but over years. And then some of them die, some of them get killed and eaten, but their bones lying in these places. So that's the biological reason for them to be there. But then when the floods come, there are increments of sediment that come into these abandoned channels and gradually fill them up. So it's not so energetic that it would take the bones away. It can orient them. We see that happening, but they are basically buried rather quickly in that context. Whereas on the floodplain, which is going much more slowly in terms of buildup, and it's also very biologically active, so things are consumed there before they can get buried. It's always a balance between burial rate and input rate.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very
Great.
good questions. Thank you. I'm glad you asked those.
Yeah, Catherine Batchelor has a question from UK.
I always have a lot of questions for Kate. Never finish asking or answering them. But Kate, thinking about your nice review of the occurrence of the bone assemblages and abandoned channels, as well as your section on alluvial architecture, I'm wondering whether abandoned channels would be, and the bone assemblages in them, would be more common in a braided or a meandering system, or some in between configuration, and whether or not you think that environment, that habitat for bone accumulation would be present in all of those systems.
Thank you. Yes, I've been puzzling over that too, because it's not one or the other. It's a gradient between, and that picture I showed, there's a braided system, but it has a meandering segment inside the floodplain of the braided systems. So there are scale issues, and these rivers, I think they do what they want basically, but they are also building up according to whether there is accommodation space. So again, it's the input versus the subsidence. And I think that for the Chinji, it was balanced in a way that the input was just a little bit less than the subsidence. So you get more floodplain type sediments. But in the Nagri, and you have all this the sand, you must have had a lot of subsidence going on, but so much sand that it was also filling up that point too. So there's a lot more to be thought about to answer that question. But the pattern of the abandoned channels, just going right through from the blue-gray system into the buff systems, there's something going on there with the way the channels were able to switch around and not just erode laterally, because if they'd eroded laterally, they would have reworked a lot of the bones, and we'd find teeth concentrated in the bottom of the channels more often. I mean, sometimes we do see that, but it would be the dominant mode. But the dominant mode in our sequence is to find these variably reworked, but mostly much more in situ concentrations of bones that we can explain by time averaging of animals that were inhabiting these particular places around the abandoned channels. So it's a work in progress.
Right. If there's no other question, I want to ask you a question that was put to John Barry, because I thought it was a wonderful question. I think maybe Bob asked it, and that is, if you could go back to the Potwar Plateau for another field season, do you still have things you want to do, and what's the first thing you do?
Oh my, I'd listen to the tree pies. And just, have a cup of tea with the wonderful local people at CORE. And anyway, yes, I would like to do a lot more with the paleosols and take more samples to look for this, more evidence of lateral variation in the isotopes, but also in the biomarker signals. And I think now that biomarkers are becoming accessible through all this new laboratory methodology, that there are hidden signals in these paleosols that we haven't even dreamed of getting, and maybe even traces of microorganisms like fungi or bacteria that could be indicative of particular kinds of recycling in the soil or nutrient sources that would also be indicating of different kinds of climate. And then, well, I would like to just go find more fossil localities to classify, to build up our tally of the different kinds there, because I suspect that new eyes and new people going out there, as well as with us, our old eyes, we would go there and find out that some of the things we think we know need some revision.
Thank you.
Oh,
We
there's
have a question from Paramjit.
from Jeet.
Ma'am, it is very wonderful talks. I'm Premjit. Ma'am, I also work on tafonomy.
Okay.
In Chinji of Siwalik, India. Well, I'm just curious to know that based on my finding, I could get the result that the faunal assemblages were deposited by fluvial activity. But at that time, ma'am, there were many carnivores, but I do not find any growth or scavenging mark on fossils. So, what is the possibility of this region, ma'am? Was that a preservation bias or something, ma'am?
Well, actually, I've done some work in modern ecosystems and looking at places in Africa where there are a lot of scavengers and carnivores, and sometimes there can be a lot of broken bones, but not very many tooth marks. So the breakage patterns themselves can be indicative of some carnivore activity. But in order to be sure of that, you have to know that they were broken before they were buried, not afterward. You know, and trampling can also be a factor in breakage. And then, you know, they have to be excavated to make sure they're not just broken fragments on the modern surface. So I don't know what kind of assemblage you have, but sometimes it's very hard to find tooth marks. We've looked very hard in our excavated assemblages, and I think there only maybe 5 or 10% of the bones have any indication that they had carnivores interacting with them. So just the fact that you don't have it doesn't mean that they weren't there and they weren't consuming the bones. Also, a lot of the carnivores of the time, well, there were saber-tooth type cats, there were some hyenas later on, but they're very careful with their teeth. They don't want it to make marks on bones if they can just eat the flesh. So that might be a factor as well. But I encourage you to keep looking, and also there's an atlas of taphonomy that has lots of examples of the kinds of marks that might be there. And if you would like to correspond, I can probably help you find some more information. I'd be happy to.
Okay, Kay, I think that was it. We don't have any other questions. So I would now ask Bob to conclude, and if he has any announcements for coming Wednesday or
Great. No, absolutely.
afterwards.
I think, Kay, it's absolutely wonderful that you've given us this time, especially in the wee hours of the morning now. And I think that it's great to hear sort of a wide-ranging talk, and the interplay between the stratigraphic record and the paleontological record is fascinating. You know, I think that some of the work that you've done and others are doing on reconstructing ancient landscapes is really the answer to many of the questions we've heard this evening. Is as we refine our ability to reconstruct literally what did the landscape look like, and whether we use analogs from the modern or we actually sort of develop models based on our observations. I think that you have set a lot of the stages for this, and I appreciate especially your pointing out that there's a tremendous amount of work that can be done right now, building on the work that yourself and others have done. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for participating this evening, and I invite you all to join us next week for the talk that will be given by Dr. Samina Siddiqui. So thank you all, and good morning in Pakistan, and good evening in the US.
Good evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Bob, and Irfan and Muktahar.
Thank you, Kay. Thank you.